Welcome to Classic Country Backstories. I'm Colleen Gallagher. As I was writing the narration for this episode, it was Christmas Eve. I had my television on a station that had a Christmas scene and some light music playing in the background. It started with Bing Crosby, then a few instrumental tunes. Then came Blue Christmas by Jim Reeves. I thought, oh, isn't that nice? Another song or two went by. Then came Blue Christmas by Jim Reeves. Then I thought, wow, that's a coincidence. I continued to read and type when Blue Christmas by Jim Reeves came on the third time. I love Jim Reeves' music, but I'll have to admit it was a little unnerving. Then I finally realized it was a music loop that would repeat about every 20 minutes. I still find it fascinating that he was the only country artist on the loop. Was it just a coincidence? Who knows? There is so much to say about Jim Reeves that I'm only able to skim the surface of his life and tragic death in a short episode. At some point, I will do another on him because his life was just so fascinating. There was no one quite like him, and he crammed so much life into a short time. Gentleman Jim was one of the earliest pioneers of the Nashville sound. So sit back and relax, and let's dive into the life and tragic ending of Jim Reeves. Nashville, Tennessee, country music capital of the world, home of the Grand Ole Opry, where singers and dreamers come seeking stardom. Join me as we learn about the lives and careers of those who built this town on Classic Country Backstories. Born August 20th, 1923, near Galloway, Texas, to 41-year-old Thomas Middleton Reeves and 39-year-old Mary Beulah Reeves. He was born at 10 p.m. in an old cast-iron bed in the front room of a house the family rented. He was the youngest of 9 children. Their rented home had no electricity and no running water. 2 fireplaces provided heat. Throughout his childhood, he was called Travis. By the time he was born, his father had already become seriously ill. Some claimed it was an ulcer, others say he had a brain tumor. He died when Travis was still a baby, around 9 months old. Little Travis' mother never remarried and raised her children with the help of the older children, who worked and helped take care of the others. Jim was exposed to Jimmie Rodgers around the age of 5 and loved what he heard. He found an old guitar that was missing a string and had been sitting out in the rain for an unknown period of time. One of his neighbors helped him fix it up, and he began to play. Later musical influences were Moon Mullican, Bing Crosby, and Frank Sinatra. Travis made his first appearance on a Shreveport radio station when he was 9. By the time he was 12, he was already playing guitar and singing at local dances with a local band, as well as performing on Shreveport's KRMD radio. After high school in Carthage, Texas, Jim won a baseball scholarship to the University of Texas in Austin. He signed up to study speech and drama. He attended college for about 6 weeks, then he ditched college to volunteer for military service in World War II. He became a welder at the Houston shipyards after failing his exam. Jim continued to play minor league baseball in several states and worked as a salesman between seasons. He joined the St. Louis Cardinals farm team in 1944, but an ankle injury ended his career by 1947. Jim Reeves met and married teacher Mary White in 1947. She encouraged his musical interests. Jim and Mary never had any children. It's been reported that Jim couldn't have them. Jim then went to work as an announcer on several East Texas radio stations. The spots allowed him to advertise his personal appearances in the area. Jim went to work for Moon Mullican's band sometime in the later 40s. He was originally greatly influenced by the Western swing sound. Jim's first commercial recording was around 1949 with a small Macy label. In 1952, Jim filled in for Hank Williams on the Louisiana Hayride when Hank failed to show up. Faber Robinson of Abbott Records was in the audience and offered Reeves a record contract. Jim's second release on Abbott, Mexican Joe, went to #1 on the country charts in 1953. The same year, he released Bimbo, which also reached the #1 position. By May of 1955, he was signed to an RCA recording contract and joined the Grand Ole Opry in October of that year. At first, Jim Reeves took a hardcore country approach to his music, but when Four Walls went to #1 on the country charts and 11 on the pop charts, his more mellow baritone style solidified him as a country pop singer. Reeves created his style by singing in lower registers while singing softer and singing closer to the mic. His style, along with Eddie Arnold and Red Foley, helped to make crossover a success for country singers during this era. Chet Atkins said in a 1975 interview, "Jim wanted to be a tenor, but I wanted him to be a baritone. One thing we know for sure is that his baritone voice is what made him so hugely famous." In 1957 and 58, Jim fronted his own radio show that fed from WSM to the ABC network. Also on the show were the Anita Kerr Singers and the Owen Bradley Orchestra. Around this time, he began to reshape his image from wearing cowboy outfits to sports coats and slacks, and even wearing tuxedos at times. Between the years of 1955 through 1969, Jim Reeves was rarely off the charts, with songs like Blue Boy, which went to #2 in 1958, Billy Bayou was a #1 in 58, and Home was a #2 hit in 1959. Jim Reeves was known to be a perfectionist. He worked closely with producer Chet Atkins, choosing material carefully. The hard work paid off. 1960 brought Jim's biggest hit, llHaveToGo, which shot to the top of the country chart while coming in at #2 on the pop charts. Reeves became a huge international star. He joined an RCA package tour to Europe in 1957, along with the 1962 tour to South Africa. He also toured Europe and Ireland. In countries where they couldn't understand English, his deep, low voice almost had a hypnotic effect. Jim Reeves also made his way to the movies, although his music always came first. In 1963, he starred in a Western called Kimberly Jim, which showcased his music. The movie was a major success in Africa, where he developed a huge following. Reeves got his pilot's license on June 30th, 1963. It's been said Jim learned to fly to combat his fear of flying. He once told Chet Atkins that he found tranquility at the controls of his own plane. It has been reported that Jim's flight instructor was also the guy who taught Randy Hughes to fly. In my research, I found no evidence of this claim. I've also seen a couple different names of the instructor. Jim's plane was a 1963 four-passenger, single-engine Beechcraft Debonair, a fast, high-performance aircraft with a six-cylinder Continental fuel-injected engine generating 225 horsepower at 2,600 RPMs. It had a wingspan of 32 feet 10 inches and was 25 feet 6 inches long. The cruise speed of the craft was 165 miles an hour at 75% power. It could fly as high as 18,400 feet with supplemental oxygen. It was a slick-looking plane with a white top base and a brown stripe. The seats were beige, and the interior paint was called Autumn Smoke. I've read some accounts that have said Dean Manuel was afraid of flying with Jim. He invited several people to go with him to Batesville, but for various reasons, no one took him up on the offer. Dean's wife, Bobby, said that Dean was drinking from a flask of whiskey to calm his nerves before flying. Stay tuned for an episode on Dean Manuel at some point. He was an incredibly talented musician and played an integral part in Jim Reeves' career. Jim's final RCA recording session was July 2nd, 1964. The session produced Make the World Go Away, Missing You, and Is It Really Over? There was some time left on the session, so Jim asked if he could record one more song. It was I Can't Stop Loving You. That was the last song Jim Reeves recorded for RCA Records. Jim recorded one more song in his home studio, I'm a Hit Again, sometime in late July. On Thursday, July 30th, 1964, Jim Reeves and his manager, piano player Dean Manuel, took off in Jim's Beechcraft Debonair en route to Batesville, Arkansas, where Jim was going to look at some land to buy for a retreat. Manuel was raised in the area. On Friday, July 31st, 1964, Jim and Dean were up early. They had breakfast at a friend of Dean's, then went to look at the land. There was fog that morning, and the skies were cloudy at times. Jim made calls to check on the weather before departing. At the time of takeoff, there was a front approaching that Jim wanted to beat. In Nashville, the skies were unpredictable. By the time Jim received his weather report from Nashville, he knew there were storm clouds coming, running east to west from the south, and that they could present a problem landing. Reeves' training should have taught him to avoid restricted visibility flight conditions and thunderstorms during any of his flight operations. He was not flying a commonly used air corridor called the Victor 140, which would have required him to fly from Dyersburg to Nashville on a heading of 84 degrees, almost directly to the airport. Jim was flying more of a southerly direction, trying to avoid rain cells. He was flying strictly by sight. Somewhere between 3:28 and 3:51, Reeves spoke by radio to the Dyersburg, Tennessee Flight Service station, who told him there was thunderstorm activity around Nashville. However, the weather data was not up to date. Ironically, the radar unit that was used by the National Weather Service office, located at Berry Field in Nashville, had been decommissioned on July 31st for a move to new quarters, so it was not in operation that day. Instead, weather radar data was being provided by the Seward Air Force Base in Smyrna, Tennessee, 20 miles to the southeast. Seward would then relay the information via teletype to the weather office at Berry Field. So by the time the pilot heard the information, it was out of date. Jim's first contact with Nashville Approach Control was that he was 30 miles west of Nashville at an altitude of 5,500 feet. At the time, light planes did not have transponders that would differentiate which plane on radar was which, so the pilot was instructed to move in a certain direction so that the radar operator could see which plane was his. At this point, the weather was still officially VFR, which meant visual flight restrictions, well within limits of a visible flight path. Jim needed 1,000 feet of visibility, and he had that. At 4:46 p.m., Jim was 21 miles west of Nashville, requesting clearance to land. It was granted. When the plane was 16 miles west of Nashville, controller John Heddish informed Jim that there was a small band of precipitation that was seen 10 miles ahead and in his flight path. Heddish told Jim to turn right to clear himself of a small area of precipitation. Heddish said, "What I wanted to do was put him about due south of the airport because it would have taken him out of the precipitation. He'd come east and then turn to the north and come back in. At least that's what I'd planned for him." But he said he was all right and that everything was going all right. Jim reported that it appeared the heading he was on appeared to take him to the right of the front. He had only about 3 minutes to change his flight path before hitting the front, so he did not follow the directions of Controller Heddish. The decision he made during these few crucial moments sealed the fate of Jim Reeves and Dean Manuel. The precipitation that Jim was seeing was apparently much stronger than he realized. The straight approach may have seemed like the fastest way to avoid additional risk of staying in the air longer. As Reeves and Manuel flew towards Franklin Road, they were only about 2.5 minutes from a safe landing. It is here that they apparently penetrated a fully developed storm. Many witnesses in the area said skies were dark and looming, and the rain was so heavy that there was little visibility on the ground. At 4:51, according to the tower tape, Jim reported that the rain was getting heavier. He said he had good visibility, then all of a sudden it was gone. John Heddish was struck by the urgency in Jim's voice as he said that he had run into rain and could not proceed VFR. Heddish said that he couldn't have been in the heavy rain for more than a minute or less. That was confirmed by the tower tape. It appears that Jim lost orientation, as later determined by the flight investigation. Neither Jim nor his passenger probably realized that they were heading straight for the ground. About 30 seconds after the controller and Reeves talked, Heddish asked Jim if he was out of the rain yet. Jim reached for the microphone to reply negative, but only got part of the word out. Then the radio went silent. The aircraft was intermittently disappearing and appearing amidst the ground clutter. There were several witnesses that saw the aircraft coming into Nashville. Marty Robbins said that he was outside when he heard the plane. He thought to himself, man, that guy's got to be some kind of a pilot or something's wrong, because you just wouldn't be flying in weather like that. Visibility was about 25 yards. He heard the engines roaring, then the crash. He ran in the house and told his wife, somebody's been killed out there. One theory is that Jim could look out of his side window to see Franklin Pike, which was familiar to him. He could have turned northward in order to keep the road in sight, trying to follow it to the airport. This theory corresponds with witness accounts. Jim could have lost control while turning. Why did Jim Reeves decide to ignore the suggestions of John Heddish? Some believe it was because he encountered a similar situation just 10 days before the crash and was able to miss the intense thunderstorm around Nashville and land safely at the same airport. Linda Price, wife of Ray Price, was contacted about the missing plane. She knew everyone in the country music scene. Within 2 to 3 hours, she had at least 200 people in the search area looking for the plane. Linda was a pilot as well. She became an unsung hero, playing an unpublicized role in organizing a search party. Stonewall Jackson, Ernest Tubb, and Minnie Pearl were among the searchers, as was Carl Smith, who searched the rough terrain on horseback. Hank Lachlan even called in a psychic. The wreckage was not found until August 2nd, 2 days after the crash. Bob Newton, who was among the searchers who found the crash site 700 feet east of Franklin Pike and 300 feet north of Baxter Lane. As soon as he came upon it, he backed out, not wanting to contaminate the area, and he found his way out of the woods to contact the highway patrol. Then he returned to the scene. The sight was too gruesome to elaborate, but I will say that Jim Reeves' toupee was found hanging off a limb. The aircraft had plowed directly into the base of a locust tree. The right wing was the only sizable part of the wreckage found. Crowds began to gather at the crash site, and law enforcement had to keep them from rummaging through what remained. Jim Reeves was dead at 40 years old. Dean Manuel was just 30. On Tuesday, August 4th, a joint memorial was held for Jim Reeves and Dean Manuel at the Phillips Robinson Funeral Home. Over 500 mourners attended. Among them were Eddie Arnold, Chet Atkins, Red Foley, Skeeter Davis, Floyd Kramer, and Ferlin Husky. Maybelle Carter was overcome with grief and fainted. No songs were sung, and the music played in the background was barely audible. The 23rd Psalm was read, and Reverend Joe Hale paid tribute to the entertainers. Dean Manuel was then buried at Spring Hill Cemetery in Nashville. Jim's body was then flown to Carthage, Texas, where his bronze casket lay in state that evening and the next day. Several thousand from all walks of life came to pay their respects to the country star. The casket was surrounded by huge floral wreaths. A picture of Jim was seated at the head of the casket. Jim's mother, Beulah, was in attendance. Jim's widow, Mary, wanted to bury Jim in a special separate place near where he was raised. She quickly purchased a plot of land, sight unseen, about 3 miles out of Carthage, Texas. In preparation for the funeral, a deal was made with city, county, and state crews, and workers rushed to the site to clear the land on Wednesday morning to prepare for Jim's burial that afternoon. On Wednesday, August 5, 1964, funeral services were held at the Central Baptist Church in Carthage, with more than 500 people crammed into the church. Country music entertainers Eddie Arnold, Ernest Tubb, Marty Robbins, Red Foley, Ray Price, and Kitty Wells were also in attendance. Another 500 remained outside the church and listened to the service on the public address system, despite the temperatures of over 100 degrees. As the crowd moved to the burial site, there was a brief rain, bringing some relief to the sweltering heat. Reverend Lewis Wright, who was a longtime friend of the Reeves family, gave the benediction at the graveside under a canopy. Following Jim's death, Mary became president of Jim Reeves Enterprises. She flew to New York to meet with RCA executives. She was concerned that RCA would release all Jim's remaining material in one big rush, and then her husband would be forgotten. She provided a strategy that Jim had actually thought of himself, to ration his unreleased recordings as if he were still alive. Mary knew Jim's catalog inside and out and had worked closely with Jim for years on his career. There were several songs that were ready to release, as well as more recordings that Jim had made at his home studio. There were even some recordings in other languages that could be released. As a result of RCA and Mary's hard work, Jim continued to have more hit records for the next several years, both here in the States and overseas. Jim Reeves went on to have 6 more #1 hits following his death, in addition to many top 10 releases. His release of Distant Drums even displaced the Beatles from the #1 spot on the British charts. By mid-1965, Mary had the Jim Reeves Memorial Site completed. The central figure is a life-size statue of Jim on a pedestal of white marble. There's a long walkway leading to the monument, which includes a guitar. Jim's dog Cheyenne passed a couple years later and is buried 3 paces behind his master at the Jim Reeves Memorial. In 1967, Jim Reeves was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Mary Reeves married Terry Davis in May of 1969, continued to dedicate her life to Jim's musical legacy. Mary and Jim's assistant Joyce Jackson could be found each year at Nashville's Fanfare promoting Jim Reeves' music. On the 15th anniversary of Jim Reeves' passing, Mary said to a reporter, "Jim Reeves, my husband, is gone, but Jim Reeves, the artist, lives on." In 1980, Jim had 2 top 10 hits with Patsy Cline, thanks to modern technology. The two never recorded together, but Jim's producer, Chet Atkins, and Patsy's producer, Owen Bradley, worked together to lift their voices off of the original 3-track stereo master to produce, resynchronize them, and record them to new digital tracks. As a result, Have You Ever Been Lonely and I Fall to Pieces were hits 17 years after Patsy's passing and 16 after Jim's. Mary Reeves Davis opened a museum in 1981, and it ran for several years in Madison. The museum was filled with Jim's personal items, such as clothing, awards, Jim's tour bus, and even their golf carts and clubs. I was fortunate to visit the museum and get a personal tour from Mary herself. The museum closed in 1996. Mary continued to promote Jim Reeves' music until her health began to fail. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and died in November of 1999. Originally, her husband Terry had her buried in a mausoleum in Madison instead of the Jim Reeves Memorial, where she stated in her will she wanted to be interred. A legal battle ensued, and eventually Mary's remains were moved to the Jim Reeves Memorial to be with Jim. After Mary's passing, there were many legal battles over Reeves' estate. After many years of litigation, the family finally won rights to the estate, and they continue to protect the legacy of Jim Reeves. Since 2003, U.S.-based Voice Master has issued more than 80 previously unreleased Jim Reeves recordings, including I'm a Hit Again, recorded in Jim Reeves' studio basement just days before his death. In 2008, the song was released in the UK and became a hit. Jim Reeves may have left us too soon, but his voice never did. From the smooth elegance of his recordings to the timeless songs that still echo across generations, Gentleman Jim showed the world that country music could be both heartfelt and refined. His tragic passing only deepened the sense of loss, but his music remains a comfort, a companion, and a reminder that true artistry never fades. Thanks for spending time with us, remembering the life and legacy of Jim Reeves. If his songs have ever meant something special to you, be sure to like and subscribe and share your favorite Jim Reeves memory in the comments. Thanks for watching this episode of Classic Country Backstories. Until next time, take care, God bless, and I'll see you later.